He hears the shots. They're fired in his yard. At or about the same time, and then she says, once the shots were fired, the men dispersed and went down the street westbound. Diane Towsley will give a similar account. 3 shots. The 2 men that she didn't know left, went down the street. What happened down the street, she doesn't know. The people on one end of the street are going to give you sort of the events that took place at the beginning. Paul Robinson, Diane Towsley, the next door neighbor here, was sick and asleep. She may or may not testify. She really doesn't have a lot of relevant information. The neighbor was one of the neighbors in 12 is a person that spends half the year here and half the year someplace else, and they weren't here. But down on the other end of the street, in this house, a lady by the name of Mary Sellers. She is a registered nurse. Within 20 seconds or so of Nicole Robinson reporting on 911 that 3 warning shots had been fired, and that's how she was describing it, in the air. This lady, right here, her address is 15. I'll have a bunch of photographs that will show up better later on. But anyway, she calls, and she says the exact same thing. I just heard 3 shots. So, at around 5:36 in the morning, we know the phone. 3 shots were fired out in the yard in 89 Aspen. After a fight, the 2 men that had previously been there had been asked to leave previously, and that they are now asked to leave again this time, but it takes force to get them away. This lady sees the shots, hears the shots. This lady hears the shots. This lady hears the shots. All at or about the same time. There will be no confusion to at or about what time. At that point, let's go back to the fight. Ms. Robinson reported that she saw a gentleman hit with a bat. The evidence will be that that was not a bat, that it was a machete. And the machete was used by Mr. Ray Greenlaw. After he had tried on a number of occasions to get these gentlemen to leave the second time, Ms. Towsley is going to tell you that not only did they mock him and they wouldn't leave, she's going to tell you that they kept coming at him. At some point in time, Mr. Ray Greenlaw retrieves his machete, waves it around, again trying to get these gentlemen to leave, but they don't get it. The evidence is going to show that before the machete, there was a fight that took place between Justin Riley and Ray Greenlaw. Mr. Riley says that, I believe he's going to tell you, and the evidence would tell you that he will, that Mr. Ray Greenlaw hit him with a beer bottle in the chin, upon which Mr. Riley punched him in the face. And it was that point in time that after a number of occasions of trying to get these people to leave, that Mr. Ray Greenlaw goes into his house, retrieves the machete, comes out and lays it, tries to get him to leave, can't get him to leave, which results in him hitting Mr. Riley in the arm. Once this occurs, Mr. Riley, as we know from the testimony of this person and this person. Mr. Riley leaves and goes down the street, as does Justin Leverett. Now, we go back for a minute, something that I had left out about the first occasion when the two gentlemen were there, about the argument that took place. Mr. Riley is going to tell you that his friend, Brian Leverett, is a know-it-all. Can't tell him anything. He's just that way. And he's going to tell you that's what started the argument in the house. But in any event, that was round one. Round two ends with them coming back, and this time being forced to leave with force. And now we begin round three. Riley is cut. And there's going to be evidence that there is blood out here in the street. He went down the street westbound, according to both witnesses and his own testimony, and at some point in time, he cuts into the backyard behind number 13 Aspen Street. And the evidence is going to be, when you get into the area where number 13 Aspen Street is, that there is a kind of a two-pronged fence around that. Part of it is chain link fence, and there is a small wooden reddish colored fence. And that he comes up to that fence, has trouble negotiating it, falls over it, and you're going to see a blood trail that shows it going in there. And that at some point in time, he comes into the backyard of number 13 Aspen Street. And this is really the first time we've got to number 13 Aspen Street and its relevance in Tuesday. It so happens that that happens to be the property of a young man by the name of Daniel Meadow. Daniel Meadow is Brian Leverett's best friend. That's how he holds himself out to be. He also is good friends with Justin Riley. And he knows Wayne Greenlaw. As a matter of fact, he's going to tell you, remember I was telling you that Mr. Greenlaw was cutting brush and stuff earlier and making a bonfire? Well, he borrowed Mr. Meadow's chainsaw to do that. And he'll tell you. And he knows Wayne. Now, he doesn't consider Wayne to be a close friend of his, but he knows him. Living in the neighborhood, knows who he is, and they've had some interaction over time. But as to the other two gentlemen, he is good friends, best friends with one, good friends with the other. And so it is his good friend, Justin Riley, that now finds himself in the backyard of number 13. And I believe the evidence would suggest this was not an accident. He went to number 13 because he knew his good friends lived there. The occupants of that house on that night were 3 people. There were 3 people in the house at number 13. I've already told you about Daniel Meadow. I'll tell you a little bit more about him in a minute. His cousin, David Royal, and his mother, Barbara Meadow. Now, they, prior to the time that Mr. Riley had gotten into their backyard, had been awakened by the warning shot. And had some conversation about it. Now, they did not see those shots. They heard them. Therefore, there's no way in the evidence for them to describe them as warning shots because they didn't see them and they know what their purpose was for. But we know from the other evidence that an eyewitness that is going to tell us what it was. That's what awakened them. And shortly thereafter, they hear Mr. Riley come into the backyard, and he is bleeding from a cut to his arm. He knocks on the window, and at some point in time, Mr. Meadow and David Royal go out into the backyard and assist Mr. Riley into the house. And you're going to see pictures of the cut, you're going to see the blood, you're going to see all that stuff, but that's what happened. lever. And the evidence will be uncontroverted that he didn't follow. He left there after his second trip that night without an invite. A second trip where he had been asked to leave. A second trip where it had come to getting him off the property, had to turn force. He proceeded down the street to his house over at number 14 Aspen. Now, this is a very unique set of streets here. It's easily confusable, but when Azalea comes and goes this way, dead ends here, Aspen comes around and it continues to go, and that continues to be Aspen. Don't ask me why, it's just what it is. So his address is number 14 Aspen. And right across the street over here is number 17 Aspen. That'll be relevant here in a minute. And we might as well get to why it's relevant to the right now. If you look closely on this, and we'll show photographs that will be a lot better than this at some point in time during the course of this case, you'll see on the back side of number 17 Aspen is a covered patio kind of porch, screen porch area, and behind, out in the yard, is a above ground standing pool. It's not a very big one, and from the photographs it looks kind of green. I don't know if you might use it or whatever, but anyway, it's there. Now, this particular date, now we're into the 29th day of October, and Halloween is right around the corner, if not there. Maybe it was that weekend, I'm not even really sure. But a bunch of young people were having a Halloween party over at this house. And I don't think it would shock anyone at this point that they were all there, including a young man by the name of Kirk Madison. Now, Kirk Madison, to be honest with you, couldn't tell you where he was. I mean, and not because he was, drunk. This is the first time he'd ever visited there. So when the police ask him, well, where are you? And he's going, I don't know, I'm visiting some friends. Well, what's the street address? I have no idea. What are your friends' names? Well, I came with two friends, but they're not the ones that own there. He didn't know the names of the streets. He didn't know the address. And nor probably should he. He just was visiting, and they were having a party. And the bottom line is that he hears all this stuff going up the street. The second time. Now, the first time, there wasn't anything that happened in the yard. There wasn't anything that happened in the street. Everything was self-contained inside the house. They were asked to leave. They left. Our clients locked the door behind them. There was no reason why anybody in the neighborhood would know that they had left. There was no noise. The second trip, not quite. Now everybody in the neighborhood. And he was no different. You can't see it now, but you will. There is a 6-foot wooden privacy fence. It's an old one. There's slats missing in various places. It's got a gate and all that stuff. But bottom line is, he hears the noise and he goes to the fence, and he's 6 feet tall, but he still can't see over the fence, so he has to step up on the little bottom portion. You guys that are familiar with a little privacy fence, there's a rail that runs kind of around the bottom, there's another one that runs around the top, and so he got up and he looked over, and he didn't see anything. He could just hear what was going on, heard argument. But he hears shots. And shortly thereafter, he calls 911. And his first, he called twice. He calls at 5:42 in some seconds. And the substance of his phone call was as follows. Just saw unknown white male walking down the street in the house. Can came back with a shotgun. That was a substantive call. Now, remember, simultaneously, as Mr. Will told you, if you lived in this neighborhood and you didn't hear it, you were either sick or dead. So, the 911 phone calls are ringing off the hook. So we already know that we had a 911 phone call from here, we had a 911 phone call from here, we had a 911 phone call from here, which again, got to go get that. I think I said that's Mary Cassell who heard the 3 shots, and she called right after. That was the 3 of them. This lady over here is Mary Fitzpatrick. She went in and got her phone, didn't make a phone call. I don't know exactly how many phone calls there were, but the point of the exercise is it really narrows down the time frame. And at 5:42, Kirk Madison calls. Sees a guy go in the house, come out with a shotgun. Now, that 911 call was very brief. Literally that, just like that. I mean, it was brief. He hangs up. Later on, he would tell the police and the lawyers in this case, when we subsequently took his statement the first time and when we took his statement the second time, that he not only saw the guy go into the house and get his gun, but he saw him walk past him the first time, because after he had heard the shots, he walked out of a gate right here on the front of the property next to the driveway, and he stood right out here, and you really can't tell from this photo. You could if you look closely and you knew what you were looking at. There's actually a basketball goal that's sitting out there. You'll see it in some other photographs. He walked out of his gate and he stood right out here kind of in the middle of that corner lot. And he sees a white male. Of course, he didn't know who he was, never seen him before. He now probably knows who he is, but he didn't know. He sees a white male go by him muttering and saying something along these lines, and I'm paraphrasing because I think he was paraphrasing as well, that they or he just chopped my friend, call 911. So he did. That's what he called. He stands out in the yard, he watches Mr. Leopard go in his house, and he says that he stays in there for somewhere between 3 to 5 minutes. Now, simultaneously with this, there is another kind of elderly lady that lives right across the street here, and the addresses can be really confusing, but the reason this is an Azalea address is because the driveway goes out to Azalea. And this turns out to be number 14 Azalea. You won't hear all that. But in any event, that's the address. And the lady that was there at the time was a lady by the name of Mary Fitzgerald, Mary Ann Fitzgerald. Mary Ann Fitzgerald got up sometime that morning. She's an early riser and she smokes. And she knows Brian Leverett very, very well. And because if you look, and you're going to see a bunch of photographs that will show you, this is the side of her house, and this little area right here is a carport. And it is sort of a lattice, kind of a carport. She described it in some other term, and I can't remember the term right now off the top of my head, but it is the kind of cinder blocks that is on the side of the garage that are those that kind of are in a star pattern, so there's about half you can see through it. She gives a term, and she'll tell you. I don't remember right now. But in any event, there are a bunch of pictures, you'll see it. And the bottom line is she comes out and she smokes every morning at about 5:30, and her garage faces directly at Brian Leverett's house. And she's going to tell you that she too saw Mr. Leverett come out of his house with a shotgun and the flashlight. And there will be other witnesses that will tell you about the flashlight. In fact, we'll kind of go back in a minute to the front part of the subdivision. We'll talk about that. But in any event, she sees him come out with a gun and a flashlight, and Mr. Medow. Now, let me start that. She says, and I don't want to misrepresent him, she says that she sees him come out with a long object. and a flashlight. Now, eventually, at some point in time, I asked her about it, and eventually she admitted that she thought it was a gun or a rifle, but her initial statement was she thought it was a long object in the flashlight. And the flashlight is on. And now Mr. Leverett, having come from his house, has taken a long object. Kirk Madison's standing right here, and he's much more specific. He says, I know what a shotgun is, there's a shotgun. So now Mr. Leverett has come out of his house, she witnesses it, he witnesses it, he witnesses him go in, she witnesses him go in, he comes out with a shotgun, light on, and he marches up the street. Round three is about three. He goes up the street, and he goes back to his good friend, Danny Madow's house. When he arrives at Danny Madow's house, he, according to Mr. Madow, he comes into his into the backyard right in between 9 and 11. Mary Cassell lives at 11, and the Maddows were at 13. Right in between, there's not a big space. I'm just kind of guessing 20 feet or so, maybe not even that much. Not big. You'll see pictures of it. But there is a fence. I told you there was a two-pronged fence that goes around it. Over on that side of the house is a chain link fence. Mr. Maddow is out assisting Mr. Riley. Remember him? He's laying out there in the backyard. And he's out there assisting him, and he hears some noise over here at the chain link fence. And his first reaction, he's going to tell you, and that's what he told the police, his first reaction was that it was his next door neighbor, Mary Cassell. She's nervous, and in fact, I think at that point in time he was probably wishing it was because, they needed some help. But it wasn't. It in fact was Brian Leverett. And he's going to tell you that he had a look in his eye that he had never seen before. That he was drunk. And that he said, I'm going to kill those MFers. I think he threw the word neighbor. You don't hear it. That conversation takes place in the yard. Eventually they work their way back from the back. Mr. Maddow goes through the carport. Remember, there's a fence on the outside, so Mr. Leverett has to walk down the outside of the fence, but they can merge with each other outside the carport, up toward the front of the property, in a general area out by the mailbox. You're going to see some photos. The mailbox is right out by the street. Well, actually, you'll see it on the photographs. There's a mailbox, right? And it's like everybody else's mailbox. It's close enough to the street when your letter carrier drives by your house every day. They don't have to get out of their car. They can reach out the window and stick your mail in there. Well, the mailbox is in the same position. Mr. Maddow is standing out there with his friend, Mr. Leverett. And Mr. Leverett is, to say the least, an unhappy camper. And at or about the same time, remember Kirk Madison is looking down the street. And Kirk Madison is looking this way down the street. And right in here is where Leverett and Maddow will be. Mr. Madison sees Leverett stop and talk to someone. Now, he doesn't know who the someone is. Remember, he's the guy, he doesn't know anybody there. And it was very dark that night. There had been intermediate showers. There would be, you're going to see photographs, the streets are very, very wet. It had rained. There are no street lights on this street. It is quite dark. So Mr. Madison sees the guy that he describes, remember, he doesn't know who he is. He sees the guy that walked by me. That's how he's going to describe me. The guy that walked by me, walked up the street, stopped briefly and talked to his friend, or someone, and then Meadow's going to tell you at that point in time, he walked further up the street. Remember, he was walking up the street with his shotgun and with his flashlight. And you're going to hear Mr. Maddow describe how he did that. And the description will be one that I think you can probably guess, and that is he had the gun, he was right-handed, he had the gun, he had the flashlight kind of setting to the top or to the side of it so that the mag light, which is what it was described as, and the evidence will show that it was, would point a beam of light in the same exact direction as the barrel of his gun. So he advances slightly up the street. Where he advances is inexact. You're going to hear 3 or 4 different versions of this, and I don't know that any of them are wrong, but I don't know that any of them are right. It just is what it is. People have their various observations about it. It was dark. It was, you know, there was distance between, who knows. But the general idea is that he left the driveway here at number 13. He advanced slightly up the street. Mr. Madison thinks that he may have come up to the next driveway, and that Mr. Maddow will tell you that he was pointing his gun with a light on it in a sweeping way. He looked for somebody, and he's going to tell you that he was looking for the brothers, because that's what he told me. That's what I were told. That beam of light was observed up the street. Let's go back up here to number 9, or number 8, where Nicole Robinson lived. On the 911 call, you're going to hear her say, "I can see a flashlight." Now, she sees the flashlight all the way up the street. And then she asked the 911 operator a question, and that question was, "Is it the police?" And the 911 operator retorts that, "No, they're not in the area." And then a couple of seconds pass, and she says, "I see a light." So, and that's on the call, and you'll be able to determine exactly when that was, or very, very close. You know, and exactly was a little bit of an overstatement, but, you know, within a few seconds. Yeah. So, she sees it. Meadow's going to testify about it. And that he came to that property with ill intent. Back to number 9 Aspen Street, you will recall that there were an observation of 3 warning shots fired out in the yard by Ray Greenlaw. And upon the firing of those 3 warning shots in the yard, the 2 gentlemen dispersed and went west. A couple of minutes later, Wayne Greenlaw comes out of the house for the first time. And he walks out to the street and looks westbound with no weapon, just looks westbound. And this is almost the exact time where Ms. Robinson is saying, "I see the light coming. I see a flashlight." She describes the person that came out there as a person that was wearing a dark shirt. I believe the evidence will show that it was Wayne Greenlaw. Bottom line is, he walked out in the street, he looked westbound, and he yelled down the street. Now, Nicole Robinson could see all this, but she could not hear what he was yelling. And I don't know what he was yelling, and the evidence will not tell you because there are a lot of different factors. But this person, whomever, I believe it to be my client, was standing out in the street looking westbound yelling. And the flashlight would have been obvious to anyone standing there because the person that is 2 houses down sees the flashlight coming up the street. And at that point in time, the person who was standing out in the yard goes back into the house and emerges from the house with a rifle. Nicole Robinson's going to tell you about it. She's going to tell you when it occurred. She's going to tell you who it was. And she's going to tell you she sees this person with a rifle. She sees, at that point, she then sees that person with a rifle come out into the yard and fire 2 more warning shots. Total of 5. 2 more. Doesn't matter. At that point, Leverett had advanced up the street, and I'm going to have an investigator that is going to fill you in on all the distances and the feet and that sort of stuff, because I believe it's relevant for you to determine who the aggressor was. But bear with me for a second, and I'm not going to give you numbers, that's his job, but trip number 1 is here, drives back down to there, that distance is over 500 feet. Walks back up another 500 feet, gets in fight, walks back another 500 feet, walks back up the street another 400 feet. The shooting took place roughly 122 feet from my client's house. It'll be up to you to determine who was the aggressor. But at that point in time, nothing good is going to happen. Man's coming up the street, armed, flashlight. Our clients have done every reasonable thing at this point in time they can to get them off of their property. It is just simply not going to happen. So my client goes down the street, and he got in front of 13 accidents. Now this was witnessed by 2 people. Well, it was actually witnessed by 4, if you include my client and Ray Greenlaw. But 2 other people have a bird's eye view of this. One of them is going to be Danny Maddow, a really good friend of mine, Brian Leverett, best friend. He's still standing out there by the tunnel. The other one is Kirk Madison down the street. Kirk Madison is going to tell you, or I expect him to tell you, if he doesn't, we'll deal with that, but I expect that he will tell you, and the evidence would tell you, that he has previously said that the gentleman that walked past him was pointing his gun in the direction of where the noise had come from in a sweeping sort of a motion. And that a man came from that area and walked into the street, and when he came into the street, that the guy who walked by him pointed his gun first at the man coming down the street. Danny Maddow is going to tell you the same thing. And they're going to tell you this. Both of them heard my client say something along the lines of this, and I'm paraphrasing again, the evidence will speak for itself, that my client said, "I've been in the military, I'll shoot you. I've been in the military, I'll shoot you." But Mr. Leverett stands right there in that street, in the corner of it, and he orders my client to put down his effing gun. Now, during the last 3.5 years, when I first looked at this, there's a request and there's orders, right? And I'll explore that with Mr. Maddow whenever he takes the stand. but you're gonna be convinced it was an order, okay? And it is the kind of conversation that you'd have at dinner. I was in put that MFing gun down or I'll shoot you. Now remember, attached to that gun by hand is a mag light. Mr. Meadow is going to tell you that was pointed directly at a voice that he heard that he believed to be Wayne Greenlaw's. At that point in time, shots were fired. You're going to hear my client. The state told you some things about what they perceived my client said. You're going to hear it, so and listen to it. I don't think what he said was a little different than what they originally told you. Now you do have to take into consideration that he had been drinking and his memory was not the best that morning, and you'll see that. But the bottom line is this. On more than one occasion during that statement to the police, remembering, of course, that he'd been up all night, that he'd been drinking, he had no sleep, and that he had just shot a human being. He tells the police that I returned fire. At some point in time, they asked him, did you hear shots or anything go by your head? He said, yeah, I believe I did. Were you in fear? Yes. You'll hear all that. Remember now, I told you earlier, his mother, Sherry Danilak, and I'm probably butchering her, I say that name, Danilak, is back in the house. She's asleep. She's been asleep for a long time. She's elderly. You'll see her. And our clients, on at least 3 different occasions during that tape, tell the police that one of the reasons that they went down the street was to protect their mother. Dead. Shots fired. Who fired the shot? Well, that's been a big issue. Now, I'm going to just briefly tell you what I expect the evidence is going to say about that. Danny Meadow is Brian Leverett's best friend in this world. And he's laying in his carport dead, and we'll talk about how he got it. If Brian Leverett didn't fire, I would expect that he would say so. But he didn't. Did you see Brian Leverett fire the gun? Yes. Did you see him fire it again? Yes. Did you hear the shots? Yes. Who fired first? I don't know. Who fired the gun first? I don't know. You'll see pictures of the gun. You'll see the gun. And there's some interesting things about that gun. One of the things you're going to find in that gun, it's a shotgun. It's a 12-gauge Winchester pump shotgun. And it has 2 shells in it. One's chambered, one's in the magazine. And the safety is off. You're going to hear an expert tell you how that could occur. He's going to tell you the number of shots that go into it. It has a plug. Plug had not been removed. And he's going to tell you there's only 2 ways that could occur, but both of them require the manual operation of that gun by whoever put that shell in the chamber. It's a pump. So you have you load the two shells into it, how you put one into the chamber, how you put another one into it, and if someone fired it, why there would only be two shells in it. You're going to see that expert demonstrate the firing power of that gun. So, it is true that Sergeant DeWeese is going to take the stand and he's going to say, I looked down the barrel of the gun and I saw it. Okay. We'll talk about that. But, remember he had two friends there that night, right? His best friend, who's standing out there next to him, come on, Brian, what are you doing? What are you doing? You'll hear that. But his buddy, Riley, is in the backyard, and guess what he hears? He hears Leverett shoot. Now, the state told you earlier, they're going to have an explanation. And their explanation is as follows. Medow only saw one person, therefore he did not know two people were shooting. I haven't told you about that yet. But my client goes down the street during this exchange. Behind him is his brother, who has a 9mm, and you'll hear all about that. One of them, they're standing very close to each other. So, the theory, of course, is as follows. Well, they didn't know there were two shooters out there. Therefore, what they heard were the other shots. That might be a problem. Danny Medow saw those shooters. And he saw them shoot. Now, over the course of 3.5 years, people give various statements. And there's a lot of factors why statements could change after 3.5 years. Heck, I'm telling you right now, if you asked me where I was on October 29, 2011, I couldn't tell you at all. I have absolutely no idea. 3.5 years has passed, don't it? I bet you don't either. So, it's understandable that the passage of time affects your ability to recall. And it's understandable that the consumption of alcohol, as you've heard, would affect your ability to recall. There are some other things that will affect your ability to recall. The stress of what they book. But there were 5 people in this, and witnesses, that weren't drinking. And one of those was Danny Medow. No alcohol. Awakened by shots. Had to get up quickly, deal with a traumatic event in his backyard. Sees his friend, he'll describe it for you, reluctantly, by the way. So, statements have the way of changing over time, and sometimes one of those factors is the relationship of the party to the other party. Trying to minimize the impact of what you previously may have said that might hurt your friend, your deceased friend. In any event, you'll hear he's going to tell you reluctantly that he saw it. He heard it. After the shots are fired, you're going to see where the shell casings are in the street, and there will be testimony about shell casings. Don't necessarily tell you where the shots actually were fired because you're in for a variety of reasons. They give you an area, but you're in the street. They bounce different weapons, project them in different ways. You're going to hear that sort of stuff. But they give you an idea, and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, in this case, really in some aspects did a really good job, and a couple others they did a poor job. But one of the jobs they did really well was they took the shots that were fired, and you guys have probably seen this sort of stuff before, where they put dowels, wooden dowels, into where bullet holes go. And when you do that, it helps you with the direction where the shot came from. So if you draw a line from that out to where they would go out to the street, it gives you a really good idea. Then you compare the shell casings to that, and at some point in time, I think it'll be fairly obvious. Medow is also going to say the following: that when this shooting started, his best friend was out the edge of the street. He had a flashlight pointing in the eyes of Wayne Greenlaw. He may have fired first. He doesn't know, but he fired. And at that point in time, Wayne and Ray Greenlaw fired. My client was carrying a Mini 14 that originally had 15 shells in its clip. He expended 2 of those in his warning shots in the yard, and to the credit of the Sheriff's Department and the law enforcement agency, they actually recovered those. Ray Greenlaw was carrying a 9mm, and it had approximately the same capacity in the magazine as did the other one, and it in fact was my client's gun, and in fact he did give it to him or suggested that he take it back in his house. We're not telling you he didn't. We're not here telling you he didn't shoot. But the interesting part about that is we have 1, 2, at least 3 witnesses hear 3 shots fired. 1 witness actually sees and hears the warning shots fired by Ray Greenlaw, which explains the number of rounds were expended down at the scene. Guess what wasn't recovered? They weren't. You know what else wasn't recovered? Shotgun shell. And there's a bunch of explanations for that. We'll talk about that at a later time. It goes into my theory of the case, and that's not what I'm here for. I'm here to tell you my version of what goes on based upon the facts and the testimony in the case. But I want to make one thing clear. These guys came there twice. The first time they came there and got thrown out. They came there a second time, he had to drive them out. And the third time, they came up that street with a gun. Pointed right at my client and said, "You need to put your gun down, I'm going to kill you." That's up. I don't know why we're here. But please do believe. Shooting into an occupied building. That's another count that my client faces. Okay? And when you hear the testimony of Daniel Medow in his statement to the police, it'll be obviously clear to you. There was never any intent at all to shoot into the carport of the building. It just so happened my client was shooting at the guy that fired at him. Now, did he expend 13 rounds? Yes, he did. Yep. And he intended to shoot every one of them, and he did. And at some point in time, the other guy turned and ran back toward the house, and according to Daniel Medow, took a defensive position at the corner of the garage and fired another shot. That would be in the carport. So, were there shells, bullet casings? No bullet casings, but were there evidence that gunshots had gone into the be carport? Absolutely. You're even going to be able to see the track that they took. You're going to know where my client was firing from, all 13 times. And what his intent to shoot in the building. It just so happened the guy that was trying to kill him. That's where the angle was, and that's where he had it. When you hear all this, nothing I have told you, nothing I have told you, should you presume to be a fact? Nothing. I've told you. If witnesses don't say what I said, what I told you that they're going to say, well then you take their statement. I represent him. I have tried my best to fairly and accurately represent what the evidence in this case will be. I'm not a witness. The judge has warned you about that. This is meant to give you a preview of the case, and the state gave you theirs. Well, we're here. We gave you ours. Thank you.
All right, at this time, we are going to take our lunch break. Ladies and gentlemen, you will be on recess until 1:45, subject to all court prior instructions on communication and investigation. You're in recess.